So I made a custom editor inside Unity, but now why would I do that when any modern level design approach is pretty simple and straightforward right out of the box? Well, I guess the main reason is speed. When you want to get an idea down, you don't want the hurdle of an interface getting in your way. One of the common ways to approach large-scale, quick level building is with a kit approach, where all pieces are designed to be able to be snapped together on a grid. The issue with it is that it's pretty slow and clumsy to click and drag individual pieces one by one to build up a level. And probably the biggest issue with it is making changes, selecting pieces, moving them or deleting them, just so you can scroll through your assets to find the right piece and then drag that one in. It's extremely slow and really hinders your creative flow. I knew there could be something better, so I came up with my own approach. I really wanted it to feel like the level design equivalent to painting. Having your idea flow through the simple act of just drawing is really the goal with this editor. It would take a while to make it, but it's worth putting in the time into making tools to make it easier in the long run. Now I knew a couple things right off the bat. I would need to make everything based on a grid, so it can keep track of what goes where. And also, every level piece or object would need to know where it would overlap other pieces, so you can just place stuff freely without having to worry about placing something over something else, or where it shouldn't be. Also, I knew that there could be some way of determining what kind of piece should be placed by what is around it. A good example of that would be the 2D tile map rule tiles. Of course, the more intricate you make these rules for placing stuff, the harder it is to make the pieces to begin with. So that goes against the initial reason for making it. Another issue with the grid approach is that stuff tends to be in blocks or squares, so doing angles is more awkward and difficult. Taking into account all of this, I knew where to start, and that's marching squares. This technique takes in a grid of density values and creates a mesh that wraps around them by some surface level. Now, of course, this is just a two-dimensional technique, but it would be pretty easy to extrude that up into the third dimension, and then continue by placing layers of them on top of one another. And I know, marching cubes is basically the 3D equivalent. Why not just use that instead? Well, I had no real reason, but more of a hunch or intuition that just stacking layers of these marching squares would be the way to go in terms of level design. I also knew it would allow me to take elements from the kit approach to make it more visually interesting by allowing the marching squares pieces to be any mesh as long as it fits the space right. So after much experimentation and trying and failing and iterating, I came up with the magic set of objects that can be placed with this approach. I also wanted to be able to use many of these sets together and have them fit together automatically. And now getting the code to place the pieces alone was pretty hard, since I can't use the typical marching squares algorithm. But now having it able to place any configuration of these sets next to each other is a whole nother ordeal. In the end, the code for this is all 16 cases explicitly mapped out in a massive, ridiculous if-else block. Not exactly the most ideal algorithm. Now, this is just the level geometry, of course, so next on the agenda was making regular objects and prefabs to be placed in the same grid. This would be a little bit more challenging, but essentially I would just need to know what grid spaces the object takes up relative to itself. And so I made a way of creating an occupancy mask that can describe what grid shape the object is. So once that was done, I could assign it to a prefab and place them down. Well, not that easy really. I still needed a way to rotate them into the right place. Now, I won't go into too much of the code, but let's just say it's not a simple algorithm to rotate one of these occupancy masks. But the answer is essentially swizzling. So after punching keys like there's no tomorrow, I finally have the editor working. I won't go into the optimization behind it since it's pretty technical, but maybe in a future video. There's many limitations to this approach and what you can do with it, but it's surprisingly flexible, and it just takes a little creativity to make some cool, interesting pieces that work with the system. Now, I will be using this to make a game after all, which is what this channel will be about, but I figured I would start with the boring stuff. That said, I also think this kind of thinking is pretty lacking in the indie scene, especially with Unity developers. It's pretty easy to get caught up in an idea and just start throwing things into a scene willy-nilly till you got yourself a game. But it's another skill entirely to have the foresight to see what you need to make before you make the game. I'm hoping this channel can help other developers think of creative solutions to game development instead of just jumping right into prototyping. Don't get me wrong, prototyping is a valuable tool, and this is an extremely difficult thing to do in practice, so I don't want to sound like I'm an authority on it. And so I'll leave the video at that before I go off on a tangent. But maybe in the next video, I'll have more about the general design philosophy behind all of this. And with that, take care and thanks for watching.